Well, greetings, all of you imagination connoisseurs here, members of the Post-Geek Singularity community. I am, of course, your host, the sanctimonious, notorious RMB, and this is the 185th live Robservations chat. Robservations is, of course, the show about something. I want to welcome everyone here. I can't believe it's been 185 chats since the beginning of the year. It should have been more, but I've slacked off on a day or two. You know, normally this should be a 7-day-a-week enterprise, so to speak. But sometimes even I can't keep up that pace. I was not here yesterday. I was not here on August 1st. I apologize. I had some work come up, some exciting work that I hope to be able to share with you in the coming weeks. Some very cool stuff. So that's good. But you know, yesterday I was thinking about something a lot, and it was sort of solidified by a letter I got from longtime member of the Post-Geek Singularity, a man who just joined up very generously at the Burnettwork.net website, Mr. Norman Lau. And I'm going to get to his letter later, but he titled it, Breaking Up is Very PICARD to Do. So I can't take credit for that pithy title. Norman Lau gave me that one, but I thought it was quite appropriate. But it really got me thinking. It made me realize I am a snob. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. I am a snob. I am a storytelling snob. I'm a snob about my horror. I'm a snob about my fantasy. And I'm a snob about my comic books and science fiction. I'm a snob about all of the storytelling I consume in all of its myriad forms. That's right. I'll freely admit it. I am a snob, and I have been living in an increasingly dumbed down world where on one hand, we're getting some amazing science fiction, fantasy, and horror. We live in wondrous times, like I always say, but we're also living in a time where we're getting some not so amazing stuff. And that's been true of the franchises that I've loved for many years, franchises that I always counted on to deliver the kind of storytelling I wanted in my very snobbish way of looking at these things. And what do I mean when I am a snob when it comes to the stories that I consume? Well, I would say, and I've talked about this before, the storytelling that I love is what I like to call, not only does it have verisimilitude, but it's three-dimensional. And what do I mean by that? What do I mean by three-dimensional storytelling? I mean that it works on a number of different levels. It can work on, say, I'll give you an example. I'll use horror films as an example to start with. When people always ask me my favorite horror movies, I always rattle off movies like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby and Romero's Dawn of the Dead and Phantasm, those kinds of things. I seldom or will never say that a Friday the 13th movie is my favorite horror film, or even that franchise comes anywhere near to be a franchise that I find worthy of my snobbery. And why do I say that? Why am I singling out the Friday the 13th franchise? Now, I will say, I saw the original Friday the 13th opening weekend, and to this day, I quite enjoy that film because it was one of those movies that worked in of course, it's a slasher film. It works in a certain paradigm. It has great kills, which is pretty much the only reason to watch slasher movies, is because of the way the psycho killers dispatch with their human victims. That's the only reason to watch those movies. But Friday the 13th had a freshness to it. It was interesting. And even though it was, it was a little one note, and the idea of when teenagers have sex, they deserve to be punished through being killed by a marauding maniac. I liked all that at the time, and at the end, spoiler alert, the Friday the 13th, first Friday the 13th, the original, has an interesting twist at the end that adds a little bit of psychology and indeed sadness to the films that were completely abandoned for the rest of the series. And the Friday the 13th movies are not about anything. They're just about teenagers and later some other people getting murdered by Jason Voorhees. Now, they would always toss us a shred of some semblance of larger story. I never bought it. I didn't believe in it. It was a lie anyway, and I knew it at the time. So the stories that I like have to have more. And what is a story? What is a story? What is any story really about? And every single story serves a singular purpose. And that purpose is to illuminate, shed light on what it means to be a human being. Every single story that you tell or listen to is a story about people going through a situation, and in some way, shape, or form, that situation and that story is relatable, hopefully, to the audience, who is gaining some insight either into their own lives or the world around them. And that's why we tell stories. We tell stories to relate our experience to other people, because in sharing our experience or experiencing someone share their experience with us in the form of a story or in the form of a song or in the form of whatever, we broaden our understanding of the human experience, because all of us live these finite lives of quiet desperation on this ball of rock that circles around the sun once every 365 days. And what does it all mean? How do we contextualize our lives? And that's what storytelling is about. And I think as a snob, as a storytelling snob, I expect a great deal from the stories that are being told to me. I want them to work, especially genre stories. Give me the genre trappings I love, whether it's superheroes or spaceships or dragons or wizards or secret agents, whatever the hell it is. I like that. I like those trappings. I'm for whatever reason attracted to those. Those are the things I like. But I will not just watch any movie where somebody straps on a cape and flies around. That's not interesting to me, or has superpowers. There's a lot of people, I have a lot of friends that, like, for instance, like horror films, and watching a marauding killer dispatching teenagers is enough. And I don't want to take away from anybody that that's enough. But I think when it comes to psycho killers and those franchises, I was always a fan of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise films, because there was a little bit more going on in those movies. Not only was there many more fantasy set pieces, it wasn't just Freddy jumping out and slashing your throat with his gloved, knived hand, but there was something psychological about those films, and how Freddy preyed on the fears of his victims, and Freddy himself was a pedophile that was dispatched by the parents of the kids that he had molested. And there was something going on in that franchise. There was more. One of my favorite B horror films that was made on hardly any money at all is Phantasm. I love Phantasm with its nightmare logic, but really at the core of Phantasm, you have the two brothers, Mike and Jody, and of course their friend Reggie. And Mike and Jody have lost their parents. And Mike is the guardian to Jody. I mean, Jody is the guardian to Mike, and he's feeling the weight of the world. He wants to get the hell out of Dodge. Mike knows his older brother wants to leave and will abandon him. And a lot of what goes on in Phantasm is working on multiple levels. And even though the movie cost less than $1 million and it was made over 3 years, and it's very much crafted with some bargain basement effects, but very clever. Don Coscarelli, the writer-director, was very clever in what he did. But to me, when I watched Phantasm, even when I saw it opening weekend, that was the movie that my dad actually took me to, watch the first 5 minutes, and walked out of when Tommy was killed after screwing the lady in lavender in the graveyard. Once she started plunging a knife into his chest, my dad was out. He let me watch the rest of the movie, though, and smoked a cigar out in the parking lot because he knew how much it meant to me. That's how cool my dad was. But I've always been attracted to movies that have more going on. Rosemary's Baby, aside from the fact that it's really about a coven of witches or coven of demonologists or coven of devil worshippers, whatever you want to call them, they basically want to bring forth the son of Satan, and that could be fun, but there's a lot more going on. There's the paranoia of a mother to be. She doesn't know whether what's going on is real or not. There's the idea that her husband, who desperately wants success on Broadway, he's willing to sell out not only his own soul, but he's willing to sell out his wife, and stands by and watches while Satan himself is conjured up and has his way with his own wife as he watches. Talk about cuckold fantasies. I mean, this movie delves into them like no other movie. It's amazing, but it really is all about ambition and what people are willing to do to one another to get that. There's a lot more going on in a movie like Rosemary's Baby. Now you can enjoy it from the element or from the aspect that yes, it's about a coven of witches or it's about a coven of Satan worshipers that are trying to bamboozle a woman and make her ripe for Satan's seed and a paranoid. All of that works great. I love all of that. But it's not just about that. The Exorcist, which is, I think, ultimately, if you ask me, probably my favorite horror movie. Now, you can watch The Exorcist and you can enjoy it. You can watch young little Regan McNeil have her beautiful innocence sullied by the presence of look, in the movie, I always thought it was the devil himself or whatever. I know it's Pazuzu later. I know that. But if you watch The Exorcist in a vacuum, it's basically the devil. And I'm the devil. Now kindly undo these straps. You know, it's really the devil. And the idea that this poor innocent girl is being completely defiled and corrupted is metaphoric. It's life that's bearing down on this 12-year-old. And Chris McNeil, her mother, played so wonderfully by Ellen Burstyn, who's an actress, she's also a single mother, and she's dealing with being in this movie and what does her own career track have to do, and she feels guilt about the way she treats her daughter. And then on the other hand, you have Father Damien Karras, and he's a Catholic priest who's racked with guilt because his mother died alone. And the fact that God has allowed this, you have a Catholic priest who's lost his faith in God. And you're following these two parallel stories. And then there's Lieutenant Kinderman who's trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And yes, it's all wrapped up in this great bow with special effects and profanity and horrible scenes where a 12-year-old girl is fucking a crucifix. And it's, you know, for horror fans, or if it gets dark. But The Exorcist really works on a number of levels. And you can enjoy it if you just want to watch it for its visceral thrills, you can. But it offers what I would call a literary framework, because indeed it's based on, of course, William Peter Blatty's novel, and he was a Jesuit. So there's a lot more going on, which makes the story richer. Now, in a world where we have all of these television shows that people love, what people consider to be the most classic of all television shows, most recent ones, I think about Ron Moore's Battlestar Galactica, reboot, him and David Icke, Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, Game of Thrones, and then all the richness that we're getting all over the place on TV. Even the genre shows, the best genre shows, when you think about Battlestar Galactica, sure, there's the Cylons and the Galactica and space warfare and sex and evil guys like Baltar. That's all there. But there's a lot more going on. I mean, if you think about it, you're examining the Cylons aren't just evil machines. The Cylons are monotheists. They believe in a one true God. Humanity hasn't got there yet. And of course, what they want, what the characters want, there's what I'd like to call, again, three-dimensionality to what it is that we're watching. And I think all of us, doesn't matter how you like to enjoy your genre entertainment, whether you're somebody that the visceral thrills of, say, Cropsey running around in the burning, dispatching people, if that floats your boat, awesome. If that's all you need from your genre entertainment, that's good. And if you're enjoying it, you're getting something out of it, fantastic. I would never want to take that away from you. Because why would I want to do that? If I would never tell somebody how they should or shouldn't enjoy something that they enjoy. Let's be clear. I never would want to do that. However, I personally am a snob. And while I won't tell them that, in the back of my mind, I'll probably be looking down on them. Let's not kid ourselves. No, I'm just kidding. Well, no, I'm not kidding. But I will remain silent because, look, there's no reason why anybody should be ever told if they enjoy something, they shouldn't enjoy it. Who am I to tell somebody that, you know what, you're just not enjoying your entertainment in a three-dimensional manner the way I think you should? But remember, I am notoriously sanctimonious. So I would never do that. And I'm happy that somebody or lots of people enjoy entertainment on that level. It's just not for me. And I want more. And what's interesting is we are living in a time where people are demanding more from their entertainment. People want more three-dimensionality in their storytelling, especially in genre storytelling. They want that. And I think you're seeing that in we all talk about all the toxicity online about whether it's Star Wars, whether it's the end of Game of Thrones, whether it's about Star Trek Discovery. But I really think that with our beloved genre fare, the things that especially our franchises that have been around for a long time, most audiences, especially the core audience, expect more from their genre entertainment. I think ultimately the reason many people, including me, were disappointed with the end of Game of Thrones, the 8th season, was it wasn't very three-dimensional. It started out that way, but then it descended into the most rudimentary one-dimensional storytelling, and a lot of people enjoyed it. A lot of people enjoyed it on that visceral level, watching Dany fly around on Drogon and burning up King's Landing. Woohoo! Well, to me, that didn't ring true, because Game of Thrones, even up through the 7th season, was, for the most part, a very three-dimensional program. The characters were very nuanced. Nothing was ever simple. They never took the easy way out. And I think what was really unsatisfying for the end of the series, for me at least, is all of that three-dimensionality after the 2nd episode of the 6th of the final season went out the window. Everything was so easy. All these answers just hit us. The end of everyone's story was just, that was it. And there was no three-dimensionality to it. And I think that when people get upset, it's because they have been let down by the storytellers. And I think that's, especially when the storytellers have been doing a great job. I mean, let's face it. When you have a book to draw from, if you're adapting a book as they had to do with Game of Thrones, you are inherently being given a three-dimensional story that works on many different levels, because the author has spent many, many months, and in some cases many years, crafting their story. And when you're reading a novel, it's inherently three-dimensional. It has to be, otherwise nobody would read it. So when you are drawing from literary material, you're already being given that richness, that three-dimensional storytelling that I'm talking about. If you're having to create something, and say as a movie or a television show, you really need creators, and you especially need somebody at the top, a visionary, who is injecting what could just be very surface genre storytelling with a lot more than that. I think a great example, and I keep going back to it, is Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad, you could have made a story about, chemistry teacher goes crazy making drugs and selling them. I mean, that could have been a very sort of surface show. But it turned out it was incredibly nuanced and it had depth that you couldn't possibly imagine. And even Jesse Pinkman, who could have been written as a very one-dimensional character, as the series progressed, we found out he was, like most people, very three-dimensional. So that's the kind of storytelling that I prefer. Now, let me bring it around to Star Trek. Star Trek, the original series, if you strip away, it's very difficult for people who came to Star Trek late or came to Star Trek not as a child when I did. If you go back and you watch the original series, I understand even the colored gels they use to light the sets are something that is very different from the kind of television, the more naturalistic TV, unless you're watching CSI, which is a lot of filtering going on there. But there's a lot going on. The superficiality of Star Trek is more than a lot of people can get through. And I understand that. Very theatrical. The visual effects are not up to, say, The Expanse quality or Battlestar Galactica quality, even though Battlestar Galactica using the idea of snap zooms and the whole combat photography thing and their visual effects, which I thought was a brilliant conceit, and it added to the verisimilitude of the show, what you were watching. It made it more believable. But I think that going back and watching Star Trek, it's hard for people now to go back and watch it with a straight face because it's become such a pop culture touchstone, and there are things within the pop culture consciousness that people just believe about Star Trek, that it was very cheap, even though it wasn't. When you're on one of their planetary sets, when they're not on location, obviously they're on a soundstage. So there's it's very difficult for people to go back and watch the original Star Trek and see what people saw when it was originally on television from 1966 to 1969. And then indeed, when it went into strip syndication in the early 70s, when a child like myself discovered it, Star Trek at its best was very three-dimensional. For a storytelling snob such as myself, I began being a storytelling snob because I watched both The Twilight Zone and Star Trek incessantly, all the time. And the very best episodes of Star Trek and the very best episodes of Twilight Zone are very three-dimensional. And even though you can have an episode like Talking Tina, you better be nice to me, I'm going to kill you. It was an overtly easy, simple plot. Killer doll comes to life, wants to kill the father of the little girl it belongs to. That can be an easy story. And indeed, a lot of the Twilight Zone episodes were pretty one note. A lot of their horror episodes, they had whammy storylines. However, one of my favorite, in the very first Twilight Zone episode I ever saw, was To Serve Man. And it freaked me out. And that is, of course, when the Canamitz come to Earth. They give a book to the United Nations, and Lloyd Bachner plays a character, a cryptologist, who's trying to figure out what the book says. But what's interesting about To Serve Man is there's a lot of commentary that goes on in 25 minutes through these characters' eyes about where humanity is at now that there's a golden age, now that the Canamitz have cured diseases and given us food, stopped famine, and what does that all mean as far as humanity is concerned? So as a kid, I might not have grasped everything that was going on in a Twilight Zone episode like To Serve Man, or even a more simplistic episode like The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, but I understood what it would have been like if your neighbors suddenly turned on you. They wanted to come into your house for whatever reason. As a kid, I'm like, okay, these are interesting. And I think watching early television like this was what made me interested in it made me interested in people. Because people are a great story. Watching great stories over and over and over again teaches you that human beings are endlessly fascinating. That's why I say everybody you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. Every story, sure, they're all derivations on a theme, but everybody's individual story has details and things going on that are interesting. And I love hearing people tell stories. I loved when I was in elementary school, we would have story time after the second recess, the half-hour recess, our long recess after lunch. Like, I remember when my favorite thing is when teachers would read to us. And I think fourth grade, it was so impactful. Mrs. Walton and my student teacher, Miss Arn, but Mrs. Walton read, like John Christopher's The White Mountains, the City of Golden Lead and the Pool of Fire to us. And that was also the same year that Star Wars came out, and that was the same year that I joined the Science Fiction Book Club. And my 10th year, when I was 10 years old, fourth grade was a real watershed moment in my life because I'd already been a Star Trek fan and Twilight Zone fan, but I started really looking at movies differently. Logan's Run had come out the year before, or maybe it came out in the same year. My fourth grade year ended with, it was, my fourth grade year was 76 to 77. I probably did see Logan's Run in the fourth grade. I don't know. I have to go on the IMDb and see when Logan's Run came out, but that was between my 9th and 10th year. It was really solidified to me. I mean, I already love movies, but I'm like, wow, movies, there was a magical quality, and genre cinema was really starting to take off. And, I saw Logan's Run before I'd read the books, but once I found out they were books, I went and got them. And I think, again, I might be wrong, I think the sequel to Logan's Run, Logan's World, that was written by William F. Nolan alone, he did not co-write it with George Clayton Johnson, but that came out. But I think that maybe that came out in 76. I'm not sure. I can't remember all these dates all the time. I my head is full of so much stuff. But anyway, the three-dimensionality of these stories were interesting. And Star Wars, the original Star Wars, also had that kind of three-dimensionality to it. I remember, cutting to the Death Star. It's still one of my favorite scenes in the Star Wars franchise when the Imperial officers are bickering about the rebellion. Until this battle station is fully operational, we are vulnerable. The Rebel Alliance is too well equipped. I loved all of that. And it's like, how interesting. And the point of view in Star Wars, not only was the single thrust of the narrative with first you start with the plans and R2 and 3PO, and then the narrative splits with Princess Leia, but then you're literally following this one tract of Luke and getting the plans back to the rebellion, and then there's Princess Leia, and then they meet. But you're learning about this universe, and it's not Basil exposition. You get to infer this information about the universe by what you're hearing the characters tell you. And as much as Star Wars is, of course, the hero's journey, it's still a very smart movie. The way, and people forget how smart Star Wars really is. Yes, the story is very classical. The actual story being told is a very simple story. It's easy to understand. However, the way it's told is pretty sophisticated. And you're learning a lot about this universe as you go. They don't stop and, the Clone Wars, or, you just hear things. They don't tell you. They just breeze by it. And then suddenly you're like, what are the Clone Wars? And you kind of have to infer what they are. They don't stop and tell you. And I think one of the great attractions to Star Wars, at least for my 10-year-old mind, is knowing that what you're seeing is just the sliver of a story. You're basically just seeing a couple days in the life of this galaxy a long time ago, far, far away, what's going on. And that you're just watching the intersection of a small series of events that later become big, but there's a huge universe out there, and they drop enough in that movie where you're like, oh my God, I want to see that universe. I want to see it. And the story that's actually being told is done so with a certain level of sophistication. As simplistic as it might seem, it's really not. So I think part of the attraction that everybody had, kids of all ages, when they saw Star Wars for the first time, was that it wasn't just a simple story. It did have, sure, the overarching story of Star Wars is simple, but the way it was told, there was a lot of nuance going on there. This idea, first of all, that, you meet Luke and it's not simple. He's not just working for his uncle and his aunt. He is an orphan. He is somebody whose friends had gone. He is wondering, what the hell am I doing here? I don't want to be here. There's a lot of storytelling happening in Star Wars that I think gets glossed over when you talk about it. We all know it's there. And when we start thinking about it or talking about it, we know it's there. And I think that it's important that, and I think, by the way, I think everybody knows when stories are great. We instinctively know, and we are, all of us, depending on whatever your predilections are. If you just want to watch psycho killers dispatch teenagers, that's okay. But I also think if you're that kind of a person and you're confronted with a Breaking Bad, or you're confronted with a Battlestar Galactica, or you're confronted with the Silence of the Lambs, you also know, if you're a fan of storytelling, when you're getting a great story. You don't just tune out because, this is too erudite for me. No, I don't think people do. I think people, whatever your level of engagement is with storytelling, or however you like to consume those stories, whenever you're confronted with great stories well told, I think if you're a fan of movies, comics, video games, television shows, novels, you're inherently attracted to great stories. We all know and can recognize great storytelling. Now, there's a lot of people where the superficiality, like I said, the original Star Trek will tune people out. Nowadays, it's very difficult to get people to watch. Like, I would never recommend Michelangelo Antonioni's Ennui trilogy to anyone, not to hardly anybody I know, unless maybe my friend Eric Wallace, who runs The Flash now. He's a guy that he'd be like, dude, that's kick ass. And but there's very few people that I would say, you've got to watch La Notte, La Ventura, and The Eclipse. Or another movie, Last Year at Marienbad, which is kind of a fantasy movie, but people now are not socialized, I think, to be able to sit down and watch these kinds of movies. It's funny to me. I've watched a lot of YouTube videos recently where people are writing appreciations about Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker. Andrei Tarkovsky, also one of my favorite directors that a lot of people can't deal with, basically made 3 overtly fantastical and science fiction movies. He made Solaris, he made Stalker, and his final feature, The Sacrifice. All 3 movies, which I love. But even I will cop to the fact Stalker, which is one of the most beautiful movies ever made, is like watching paint dry. As an aside, there's a cool video, I don't know who made it, which talks about how everybody who worked on Stalker basically died of cancer because of everything they had to encounter when they made that movie. It was basically made 3 times. It's a great, really interesting story, but I would encourage everybody to look that up. So anyway, back to Star Trek. So I have been known as somebody, I guess I've turned into some cantankerous, fuddy-duddy, get off my lawn Star Trek fan. But when I was growing up, watching the original series and reading Star Trek novels and watching the animated series, Star Trek was very what I called 3-dimensional. It really appealed to my sensibilities. The culmination of that was Star Trek: The Motion Picture. It was, I thought, amazing. And even though, sure, people would say, oh, it's like The Changeling and it's like episodes we've seen before, I loved it because at its core, one of the things I love about Star Trek: The Motion Picture that is never talked about enough is our 3 main characters, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, all are in places where they're not happy people. And I had never seen my heroes, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. They were always like they'd fight in the course of episodes and argue. But for the most part, they were, well, Spock, of course, would never admit he's happy. Let's just say Spock was content. He was contented with his place on the Enterprise and where he was in his life. When we meet him in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, he is discontent. Not only that, he fails. When we meet Spock in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, he has failed at the culinary discipline. He has not purged all remaining human emotion, which is what he wanted. But really, that's not what he wanted. That's what he thought he wanted, and he was wrong. So that's one of the things that made Star Trek: The Motion Picture interesting to me. And then when he feels the ultimate logic calling him from space, I'm not going to recount the whole thing, but it was interesting when I first saw it. I was completely riveted by the fact in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, we see these characters that we've known and loved, that I knew and loved, that I obsessed over. Basically, my saints, apostles, whatever you want to call them, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, were unhappy. McCoy didn't want to be on the Enterprise. You found out that he was studying Fabrini medicine The World is Hollow, for The World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky. You found that out in the novelization. Spock had just failed at the culinary discipline. He just wanted to find out what was up with V'ger. He didn't necessarily want to be on the Enterprise, but he knew that he could get on the Enterprise and that would take him to where he wanted to go. And Kirk was, of course, out of his element. He allowed himself to be promoted, and he was head of Starfleet operations, sitting at a desk for 2.5 years. These guys were miserable. And I'd never seen that. And I, as a 12-year-old, when I saw Star Trek: The Motion Picture, moving into my adolescence and teenage years, I didn't know where I was going, what was going on. So I really related to Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And over the course, that was an element in the film that surprised me. And I'm like, how interesting that is. These guys aren't happy. By the way, they copied this in Star Trek 2. They just replayed this idea. But it was done so well in Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And by the end of the movie, our characters, and by the way, you have to doubt Kirk. Kirk's being kind of a dick. He's doing things that are reckless and stupid. He doesn't know the Enterprise, but then you watch him understand what he doesn't know. He's smart enough to know what he doesn't know. He figures it out, nudged by his friends, but he figures it out. And when he finally, there's that great moment when he's like, when Decker says, "It's as your XO, it's my duty to point out alternatives," and Kirk's about to yell at him. He goes, thinks about it. Yes, it is. And it was interesting to me watching these characters. It felt very real. It felt very three-dimensional. And I love Star Trek: The Motion Picture for a lot of reasons, but that's one of them. And it's something that doesn't get talked about much. They sort of replayed it in Star Trek 2, but in Star Trek 2, to me, Star Trek 2, as much as I will cop to the fact it is the best Star Trek movie easily, not my favorite, Star Trek the Motion Picture is, but Star Trek 2 is the best. But what I thought about Star Trek 2, and maybe this is controversial, I think that Star Trek 2 was the beginning of the end of the Star Trek that I truly loved. People are going to be like, what? They just discount my opinion about further Star Trek forever. And I'll explain what I mean. The character of Khan in Space Seed, if you're an original series fan, if you go back and watch Space Seed, the original, when you're introduced to Khan from the first season, Space Seed is a very three-dimensional story. Now you can look at it as a madman is frozen from the past and tries to take over the Enterprise and kill everybody. You could look at that. But I would ask you to look further. There are scenes in that movie, such as I think it's one of the great scenes in the original Star Trek, when they sit Khan down and they're questioning him, and they're also, before that, they're debating over what you find out he was a leader of a quarter of the world's population. He was genetically engineered, and Spock and McCoy and Scotty and Kirk are talking about what it meant to be a product of controlled genetics. And when you meet Khan is not a mustache twirling villain. He is very nuanced, and he is very thoughtful. And yes, he's got an ego on him because he was engineered to be that way, but he's also damn smart. And what he wants to do is build a world in not just his image, but I think he wants to build a world in the image that he knows it will succeed. He might be misguided, but as somebody who's genetically engineered to have an intellect, the man probably, now they don't get totally into this, but the man probably knows more about philosophy and history and social theory than a lot of other people. And the problem with his leadership, as Spock points out in that episode, is that when you have a bunch of genetically engineered people, they all have that ambition. And as Spock cannily says in the episode, superior ability breeds superior ambition. And within this 52 minutes of Space Seed, there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening, especially with the character of Khan. And when Kirk realizes, and Marlon MacGyver says it earlier, I don't think you're going to like living in our century because it's calmed down a bit. And people like Khan, those kinds of visionaries, despots, whatever you want to call them, they're not going to fit in. Khan, let's say, was not woke enough to live in the 23rd century. Kirk knows this, so drops him off on SETI Alpha 5. And then at the end of the episode, we're left with Spock musing, it would be interesting to return, I'm paraphrasing, but it would be interesting to return again someday and see what kind of fruit sprouted from the seed you'd planted today. I mean, it's very interesting. It's very sophisticated. It works on a number of different levels. In Star Trek 2, as much as I like it, and as much as I love Ricardo Montalban being over the top, and a lot of this has to do with Nicholas Meyer famously coming in. He doesn't get any screenplay credit in Star Trek 2, but Jack Sowards does. But he did famously rewrite all of Star Trek 2 weeks, just mere a couple of days even, before shooting, and it's his script that made it to screen. Let's be clear. Now, it's still a great script. Another one of my favorite Star Trek scenes ever is Kirk and McCoy in his apartment on his birthday talking about what's happening. There's great stuff in Star Trek 2, great character bits. But the central storyline is basically, like many great Star Treks, lifted from someplace else. In this case, it's very Moby Dickish. There's a little, of course, Tale of Two Cities overtly. But when I say Moby Dickish, I don't mean dickish like you're a dick. I mean literally Moby Dick, Captain Ahab, all of that stuff. And the portrayal of Khan is delicious, but I wouldn't call it three-dimensional. That you can say, okay, he's upset about, he's bent on revenge, and it's great seeing these speeches. But what I really missed was the philosophical Khan, the musings of Khan that we got a hint of in Space Seed. I would like to have seen, and of course this would have been a different movie, and it would have taken away what I loved, the success, the joy. Star Trek 2, I think, was the first time that non-Star Trek fans could sit down and watch a Star Trek movie and truly enjoy it. because you don't need to have any knowledge. You don't even need to know. You don't even need to have seen Space Seed. So I understand that Star Trek II is not just the best Star Trek film. It also kept Star Trek alive because Harv Bennett and the television department of Paramount took it over and made it for a price. Star Trek the Motion Picture, of course, was made for $44 million, and at the time was one of the most expensive movies ever made. A lot of that had to do with the fact that they had to roll in all the development costs from both, well, things like the Star Trek Planet of the Titans film that never got made, and all of the production costs for the Star Trek Phase 2 television series that didn't get made. So Star Trek the Motion Picture was making up for a lot of lost time and a lot of lost money. So Star Trek 2 had to be made for, I think it was $11 million, much, much, much cheaper. And it did very well. And audiences love it, even to this day, because it's not as three-dimensional as I'm used to from Star Trek. And since then, I don't think Star Trek has ever achieved the three-dimensionality that it had. Maybe it did. I mean, now this is not true of, I'm talking about the original series. Now, Star Trek, The Next Generation began pretty one-dimensional, and then it sort of developed into it. But it's still, the writing was never as sophisticated as the writing on Star Trek, even though the original Star Trek, although it's got great stuff. Deep Space Nine really got into three-dimensional storytelling and the shades of gray, and I really thought it delved into, I think Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the problem with Deep Space Nine, by the way, is that you can't call it overall a great show. It's not one of the great shows of television because it didn't, until it found its footing, really beginning with season 4. Season 4, 5, 6, and 7 are some of my favorite modern Star Trek of all. Although it's probably the least like Star Trek of any of the shows. But what does that have to do with the topic of all of this? Now that I've given you my preamble, I've given you my musings, so to speak. First of all, before I get to it, I know I'm seeing a lot of chats come in. Let me before I get to this letter that has precipitated this chat, I'll see what people have to say here. JB Bonifacio is here. JB, I want to thank you for your ongoing support of the channel. You're a good man. You know what they say, RMB, if you love it, let it go. If it comes back to you, it's meant to be. People see other shows all the time. Laugh out loud. Happy Friday. Well, JB, I'd like to say that, you know what they say? If you love it, let it go. If it comes back to you, it's meant to be. If it doesn't come back to you, you hunt it down and you kill it. No, I'm just kidding. But thanks for the happy Friday, and thanks for the thoughts. Factual Opinion asks, thoughts on The Next Generation's Who Watches the Watchers? That was I love Who Watches the Watchers. It's a phenomenal episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. It's an early 3rd season episode with the Proto-Vulcans. It's a great, great, great episode. It deals with why the Prime Directive is so important. I think it's a wonderful episode, not only of Next Generation, but of Star Trek. And it's one of those episodes like that I didn't love it the first time I saw it, but it certainly has grown in my mind to be one of the greatest episodes of the Next Generation. Mark C is here. Hello, Mark. Thanks for being here. A foreign film I enjoy is City of Lost Children. I don't know about subtext, but it's a visual treat. Marc Caro and Jean-Pierre Jeunet directed that movie. I love City of Lost Children. It was a follow-up to their first film, Delicatessen. I am a huge fan of that film. Of course, I met my love Elizabeth because we loved Jean-Pierre Jeunet's Amélie, and I'm a huge fan. City of Lost Children, I think, has a lot to say. It is a visual feast. But yeah, I mean, look, I'm not saying that I think Blade Runner is a visual feast, and there's not a lot there, but when the stuff that is there is really compelling. The idea of asking, what does it mean to be human, that kind of thing. Licardo Guira, what a cool name. I like that name, Licardo. I just watched DS9. By the way, thanks for the support. I just rewatched DS9. It's a deep show. Why does it feel like fans don't respect Sisko as much as other Star Trek captains? Here's my theory about Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine is really difficult to get into. The first season is really rough. I think Emissary is the best Star Trek pilot of all modern Star Trek. I think it by far is. But the first season is really kind of all over the place. They don't really know what they're doing. And I think Avery Brooks's performance is very affected, if that's the right word. It's tough to get into. I don't even think Avery Brooks is comfortable in his role till he shaves his head and grows his goatee. But I think it's hard. People find him if you get to the fourth season of Star Trek, of Deep Space Nine, then it becomes very rewarding. But I think when people first try and of course everyone talks about the fact that it doesn't live up to Roddenberry's vision of utopia, but the reason the people that love Deep Space Nine love it is because of its three-dimensionality, because of where it goes, and because that it has not only does it have a great cast, but it also has a great secondary cast. All the people they introduce, especially as you get further in, Salome Jens as the head founder, and Jeffrey Combs as the different Wayoons, and Mark Alamo as Ducat, one of the great villains ever on TV. I think people have to get into it and watch it, but it's rough. I mean, I've always told people, if you want to get into Deep Space Nine, all you need to do is watch Emissary and then Duet and In the Hands of the Prophets. That's all you need to do. I don't mean to denigrate anybody who worked in the first season, but if you watched those 3 episodes and then moved into the second season, which begins with a really interesting 3-parter, I think you'll have a better experience. I mean, Move Along Home, you have to go through episodes like that in the first season. It's rough. It's rough. Willow Yang is here. Willow Yang said, would you be able to give me some sound advice on how to watch the motion picture to fully appreciate it? I saw it recently, and, well, I want to give it a second viewing before giving my thoughts. Well, I would say, Willow, that the thing that you have to do is track down the director's edition, not the director's cut. I was informed at San Diego Comic-Con this year. It's not the director's cut. It's called the director's edition. It's the DVD. It's unfortunately not on Blu-ray because of the visual effects. I think the director's edition is a far superior version of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And I would say this, Star Trek: The Motion Picture also mirrors some of my favorite episodes that are more of the very somber episodes of Star Trek, such as Doomsday Machine and the Immunity Syndrome, or even Obsession. And I would watch it like that. And, keep in mind that Star Trek: The Motion Picture is also the first time we saw Earth in the 23rd century. It really shows how foreboding and dark the cosmos is, how unknowable it is. But, that doesn't make it more entertaining necessarily. But concentrate on the character interplay. And I always tell people, like I just said, how it begins as a movie where no one's having a good time, and how as the movie progresses, these people that are lost without one another come together again. And one of the great things about the director's cut of the film, which is more than 10 minutes longer, is there's a lot of material that was only seen in the ABC television cut. There's scenes that we haven't seen that really solidifies the relationship and what's actually going on in the movie. It's all character moments. They're all wonderful, especially stuff with Spock, because Star Trek: The Motion Picture, I think, of all Star Trek, has the most fundamental character change in any Star Trek movie, and that is seeing that Spock understands the value of humanity and emotion, something he has been keeping at bay his whole life. He realizes, since you've seen Star Trek: The Motion Picture, I'm not spoiling anything when Spock, after his mind meld with the V'ger intelligence, when he comes back to the ship, he takes Kirk's hand and he says, "This simple feeling is beyond V'ger's comprehension." And he's realizing then and there what's going on. And I really think that it's a wonderful movie, especially if you watch the director's cut. It still can be had. It's on DVD. I'm sure it can be picked up for not a lot of money. I don't know if it's torrented. Probably is. By the way, I don't condone that. I'm just saying you can't get it. You can't get the director's cut anymore. It's been out of print for almost 20 years. So in that case, I would say, hey, Paramount, why haven't you done a 4K restoration? Nay asks, why did Riker always sit on a chair in that weird cool way? Was that Frakes' decision? That's called the Riker maneuver. There's many beautiful videos that you can find on YouTube. Just punch in the Riker maneuver. But yeah, I think that was just a Frakes. Frakes is a pretty big guy. I think it was just something. It was just a tick that he probably did in an episode, and a director said, that's interesting. I mean, whenever you can make an actor sitting into a chair seem more interesting, you're always better off. Okay, now here finally, 50 minutes into this chat, I come to Norman Lau. Norman Lau, again, Norman Lau is a longtime member of the Post-Geek Singularity community. He's a great guy. I really like Norman. He's a big supporter of the channel, which I want to thank him for. Norman Lau wrote me a letter. He hasn't written me in a long time. He used to write me a lot, and usually I would make his letters the topic of conversation. But he wrote this, and I wanted to. First of all, you know what? But before I read this letter, let me just remember to say that these chats are brought to you by Lucky Tiger Men's grooming products for those men who want to look good and feel great, which I appreciate very much. And if you go to their website at getluckytiger.com and buy any of their products, if you punch in PGS for Post-Geek Singularity, when you check out, you get 20% off your order. And I need to do that actually because I've had my all over body wash stolen by Elizabeth's 18-year-old daughter. She has absconded with my Lucky Tiger all over body wash. So that shows you it's not just for men. So I need to get some, and their facial scrub is phenomenal. So anyway, hey Rob and Mike. Mike, of course, being Mike Bodden, one of my beautiful moderators, also the Honorable Mayor of Riverdale, Iowa. Hey Rob and Mike, I wanted to send this through for the letters. Hey Rob, once again, thanks for reading my letter. I apologize for not being as active on your channel as of late. I have several YouTube and social media projects of my own, and I'm trying to get off the ground, which is taking up a great deal of time, as you well understand. By the way, Norman does a great Babylon 5 podcast. I think it's called The Zocalo. But something came into crystal clear focus recently, and I wanted to share this with you and all of the imagination connoisseurs. This is more of a confession, or at the very least, a truly honest revelation. And what I'm about to say, I thought would never, ever cross my mind, or my lips, or even enter my heart, or in this case, typed out on a keyboard. I have fallen out of love with Star Trek. Now, this sounds like I'm some type of romantic or emotionally dependent. This sounds like I am in some type of romantic or emotionally dependent relationship with Star Trek. But in many ways, I am. We all are. Well, at least those of us who still consider ourselves Trekkies, Trekkers, etc. Think about this in the strict definition of a relationship. Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary states specifically in definition 3B, a romantic or passionate attachment. That is precisely what I, and many of us, have with our fandoms. And in this specific case, Star Trek. We are attached emotionally through our intangible love and care for Star Trek, physically as we act out our fantasies through cosplay or fan projects, and financially as we have invested hundreds upon thousands of dollars supporting the idolatry that is our love of Star Trek. It is, for lack of a better term, our golden idol, the golden calf of idolatry that offered the fleeting and exiled Jews of Egypt comfort and solace as they traversed a wasteland of the loss of faith. So get to your point. Your listeners may be mentally screaming at me right now. I don't think so. They listened to me ramble on for 50 minutes before I got to this letter. The point is, and the thrust of my letter is, I am no longer in love with Star Trek because I no longer feel any passion for it at this stage in our relationship. And to borrow a very familiar phrase when it comes to breakups, it's not you, it's me. And this is also 100% true when it comes to how I feel at this current stage of my Star Trek fandom. As with all relationships that are in decline, there is a catalyst and a systemic behavioral and tonal shift in the emotional connection that evolves and perpetuates the downward spiral. And I know exactly when that moment happened. It was the moment when I realized I just don't care about you, Star Trek, anymore. It was at this year's San Diego Comic-Con. It was the premiere of the PICARD trailer. I watched it 3 times in succession. And I didn't even care. Not one bit. Not one fluttering heartbeat or arched eyebrow or one goosebump to be seen. Nothing. I felt depression shortly after, not because I was disappointed at what I saw in the trailer, but because I realized at that very moment, Star Trek right then and there, and perhaps for the foreseeable future, means nothing to me. And I feel like I have been betrayed a part of me. Oh, and I feel like I have betrayed a part of me. The part of me that has been influenced, molded, forged, shaped, and governed by Star Trek and its principles for so many decades. In fact, most of my entire life. I know that Star Trek will never be all-encompassing for every fan, and I even can admit that I love the original series and the TOS cast movies more than any other series or movies pre-Abrams verse. And I was okay with that because I knew that at least the Roddenberry, Berman, Piller, Braga eras of Star Trek still were faithful to the overall vision that Gene set out to achieve. So where does that leave me now? Where does that leave all of you out there who may feel the same way that I do? Well, to quote Lorian from my favorite show of all time, Babylon 5, when the long night comes, return to the end of the beginning. The beginning in this case was when I fell in love with the original series so many decades ago. The end of that beginning was the final episode of Enterprise in May of 2005. This is the relationship that I will ever be in love with, and perhaps for me, the memory of a perfect relationship that I just need to stay with. In admitting this to myself, to you, and to now the public, I realize that I have not betrayed my Star Trek fandom, far from it. I now know that I can move forward into the next phase of this relationship with eyes wide open, with a more guarded heart and an even more cautioned soul. Because I don't think I will be able to emotionally survive another breakup like this one. In Valen's name, Norman C. Lau. I will tell you, he's at Zocalocast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and that's at ZOCALOCAST, Zocalocast, which I guess is the name of his Babylon 5 podcast. I would strongly suggest everybody listen to it because it's great. Now, I want to say I agree with you, Norman. I do. And I feel for the last decade, I feel like Star Trek was the love of my life. And 10 years ago, well, in 2005, Star Trek was the love of my life even older than that. I mean, it wasn't, I really love the original series. And I love Star Trek the Motion Picture and Star Trek 2, but then the movies started to let me down. No, I enjoy, like I talked at length about Star Trek 3, I enjoy Star Trek 4 and Star Trek 5, is what it is, and Star Trek 6 as well. But again, they seem all of the Star Trek movies after Star Trek the Motion Picture, while Star Trek 2 is enjoyable, it's still ultimately very rudimentary. And it did not bring me, the modern Star Trek has not brought me the three-dimensional depth of the storytelling that I, as a storytelling snob, desire. When I think about my favorite movies in life, people always are incredulous. I tell people the Godfather movies. The reason the Godfather movies endure, especially Godfather 1 and 2, is that even though, yes, they're movies about the mafia, they are, as Francis Ford Coppola always put it, a movie about his king and his three sons. And it is so nuanced, and it delves into so many human truths and behaviors and what does it all mean and where are we? And, the whole idea that Michael Corleone, even though what he does is tactically correct and logically correct, he's forgotten what his father knew so well. He's forgotten his own heart. He's forgotten his own humanity, and he's become a ruthless monster because he gave up his soul. I mean, that to me is what makes the Godfather saga so interesting and tragic. And that's why I love The Godfather so much. all that jazz, is a movie about a man who his passions that govern him, his passions to work and to create and for women are his undoing, that ultimately, because of the way he feels, death becomes more appealing to him. I've always found that movie, it's one of my favorite films of all time. It made me want to be an editor. All the movies that I love have these things going on, and Star Trek did as well in my life. And I feel that, unfortunately, Star Trek has become, as a whole, something that is now its product. It's being made by people that talk a good game, but really that's all they ever did was there's no vision. Star Trek has never had it for the last 10 years. And like Norman points out in this letter, even with the Berman era of Trek, remember, Berman was overseeing 25 seasons of Star Trek. And while he might not have been the best person to write the predominant number of episodes he wrote for Enterprise, at the end of the day, Berman understood that there was a core ideal that he was trying to uphold, which was Roddenberry's utopian vision of the future that he understood working with Roddenberry when they were developing Next Generation before it was even made. So at the top, you at least, Rick Berman might not have been the most visionary creator, but there was a fealty to a certain type of Star Trek that was being made, and it gave us a lot of great Star Trek, and it gave us a lot of mediocre Star Trek, and it gave us, let's face it, some bad Star Trek, and that's true of all Star Trek, but there was still a unifying theme happening. And whether you believe in his vision or not, there was a vision from the beginning. And for the last 10 years, the stewardship of Star Trek has been visionless. What we're seeing is Star Trek, they try to make Star Trek into other things. The Star Trek-ness of Star Trek has been completely excised, and it's gone from Star Trek. And that's, again, if you enjoy modern Star Trek, I do not want to take that away from you. And if you're getting something out of Star Trek, far be it for me to tell you what you should and shouldn't get out of something, because why not? But just like Star Wars, I think Star Wars and Star Trek are suffering from the same problem. It's that they're now owned by larger corporations that are exploiting them. And again, I mean, this is true of any corporation that's wanting to make money and selling a product, but it's kind of like income inequality in this country. All of these things, the driving force behind the creation of them is the money they're supposed to be making. You don't have people like when Gene Roddenberry came on board and was able to revitalize Star Trek. While, yes, he wanted to get paid, and he made sure that he was paid money that was owed to him because he was getting ripped off by the studio. I get all that. Everybody wants to get paid, G. I get that. But Gene Roddenberry wanted to bring Star Trek back. He wanted to prove that this legend, that this thing was not relegated to 3 seasons and 2 animated seasons and the 1 movie that he got to make, and then people took it away from him. He wanted to come back to the studio, and he wanted to make and remake Star Trek in his image and make it successful again. His desire wasn't simply to make money. And look, and it was his creation, And for better or for worse, Star Wars was George Lucas's creation all the way up until he sold it to Disney. So the very reason that these things exist now, the very reason that both Star Trek and Star Wars exist, is now to be a franchise that's going to be exploited. The fact that now Star Trek, we've got the PICARD series, we've got the Nickelodeon animated series, and 2 friends of mine are on that show as writers, so I want it to succeed. We've got Star Trek Lower Decks being made. Who knows what's going to happen with Star Trek? But again, the Burnett axiom, never put your universe before your characters or your story. What we have now is a franchise that is not doing that. We have a franchise that is designed to broaden the Star Trek brand. They even finally have a Star Trek brand manager in John Van Sitters, who I like very much. But the whole reason these franchises exist is, once again, where they hire people to make them. But unlike the MCU, where you have a visionary like Kevin Feige, I mean, you want to say that Alex Kurtzman is the visionary? No, he's the figurehead. The reason, look at the changing showrunners. How many teams have made Star Trek Discovery in 2 years? We have different changing showrunners. There is no vision behind Star Trek, just like there is no vision behind Star Wars. It's work for hire now. And that's, I think, the real problem is that even when we didn't like the prequels, we knew there was a vision behind them. And the reason we didn't like them was, for better or for worse, still the vision of one man. And I think with Star Trek, it has this lack of vision is, I mean, they gave Star Trek to a man who, I've said this before, in every interview said he never liked Star Trek. It was too intellectual for him. Well, the three-dimensionality of an allegorical sci-fi action adventure television show, the three-dimensionality of the original series is why Star Trek has endured for over 50 years. And if you're going to make Star Trek, if you want it to endure, if you want it to matter, the more three-dimensional, the more you can give us great storytelling, the more your audiences will embrace it. You can't just pretend you're giving it to us. You can't just pretend. There's a lot of great TV being made all over the place, and we all recognize it when we see it. And certainly the Star Trek movies did not catch on the way, say, other films did. The Star Trek movies didn't even catch on the way the Fast and the Furious franchise did. Why is that? You've got a built-in family. Family didn't work. For as much as I like the actors, they did not give them stories that allowed people to care about the new casts, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. You don't care because the stories that were told did not paint those characters in a good light. They were painted in a very generic light that didn't give them a chance to shine, so nobody cares, unfortunately. All they care about is the residual good nature they have toward Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, no matter who plays them. Just a theory. I could be wrong. Adam Blue says, hey, Rob, I just discovered the original Gundam. Lots of three-dimensional storytelling. Absolutely. Like a darker Star Wars. Are you familiar with it? Adam Blue, I love Gundam. For those of you who don't know what Gundam is, Mobile Suit Gundam is a Japanese anime that first debuted in 1979. And it's great. It's basically, well, about the futility of war. And there's a lot, if you like The Expanse, there's a lot of similarities with Gundam. Basically, there are these giant orbiting space colonies called Sides that start their own government, the Principality of Zeon, and they want to defect from the Earth. There's a lot of reasons why Earth doesn't want that to happen, and war breaks out. They've been making Gundam now for 30 years. It's 30 years old. Pardon me, 30 years. It's 40 years old. And Gundam is really interesting, and I've talked about it a lot because there is the core Gundam mythology, what's called the universal century of Gundam, which all is set in the same continuity. And then there have been Gundam shows that have completely looked at the Gundam idea from different areas. Gundam Wing. They actually made different, they kept the core ideas, but they made their own universes so new people could jump into Gundam and enjoy it. Things like Gundam Wing, Gundam Seed, Turn A Gundam. Gundam is very, very, very interesting. And if you've never seen Gundam, the animation, of course, from 40 years ago is a little dated, but I would suggest jumping into Gundam Unicorn. It is Universal Century continuity. It's very interesting. Or the recent Gundam The Origin that started in 2015, which is a retelling from a much larger canvas of the original Gundam story. I hugely love Gundam, and I'm a huge fan. As a matter of fact, here's something kind of crazy. I forgot I was going to bring it on the show. But back in 2003, I found a place online called Foundry DX. And this guy, I was going through a huge Gundam kick back in 2003 when I was working on the Lord of the Rings Blu-rays, and then moving over to the Lord of the Rings Extended Edition, and then moving over to Chronicles of Narnia. I went on a big Gundam kick, and I was buying a lot of Gundam die-cast and Gundam models. There was a guy who made these customized Gundam Lego sets, and he made an RX-78 Mark II, the Dash 2, the classic Gundam. He did a Lego of that and one of the Xeon mobile suits, and I bought it. And I found it in my garage yesterday. I never made it. It's still in the box. It's all faded. I'd never opened the parts. And so yesterday I brought it in, and Elizabeth's like, what is that? I go, did you buy something else in the mail? I said, no. This is actually from 16 years ago, and the guy who did Foundry DX wrote me a personalized letter. Thank you for buying this Gundam set. You know, it's all really well done, and it's really cool. I started building it. I've just been putting the actual shoulders and arms together, but I'll bring it on the show in the next couple days. Anyway, that's just an aside. I loved that. Love that set, and I love Gundam. I highly recommend it to anybody who likes science fiction. Jordy54 says, I sent a letter on short films. I'd love your opinion. Jordy, I will get to it. We'll look out for that letter. With Comic-Con and Mike being gone, I need to catch up. There's a lot of letters I've missed. John Suntress of the Word Balloon Podcast is here. John wants to know, did Michael Chabon, did Calypso feel enough like Star Trek to you? That was one of the short takes. Michael Chabon, one of the new showrunner of, it's either Michael Chabon, Michael Chabon. I gotta get a ruling on this. How do you pronounce his last name? Huge fan of Michael Chabon. I love his work, love his books. I thought that they were great. But did I like about his Calypso? Well, his Calypso, it's interesting because Discovery went 1,000 years in the future. Well, I guess canonically, in Calypso, the whole crew is missing, and the Discovery's been sitting around, and that's when an alien arrives, a humanoid arrives on the Discovery. Did that feel like Star Trek enough? No, it didn't to me, actually. By the way, if you don't, you got to listen to John Suntress's. Look up the Word Balloon Podcast. It's one of my favorite pop culture podcasts. If you like comics and things, he's got great messages, great guests. Great guests. His message is great because he is excited about pop culture, just like I am. But the episode Calypso felt sort of like a generic science fiction story to me. I mean, I guess it was heartwarming the way many Star Trek episodes could be. It didn't really feel like Star Trek. I mean, it was a story set in the Star Trek universe, and I'm sure from that perspective it was fine, but I didn't love it. But we'll see. We'll see what he does with Picard. Let's see. There was somebody deleted their message, but thank you for the support of the channel. Dan Allen says, I meant to send a message, but it didn't send properly. It was about myself being labeled a film snob because I like to watch good films and not bad films. Well, Dan, that's interesting. Okay, you know, I talked about my love of B movies, and I think everybody likes to watch good movies as opposed to bad movies. But here's the thing. My definition of movies I enjoy, for instance, I like the first Transformers movie. I like the third one, Dark of the Moon. Now, they're B movies to me with A-list budgets. I think the first Transformers movie, the story about a boy in his car, and I thought it worked. I thought the photorealistic Transformers there's a lot of stuff to love in those movies. Would I call them the greatest movies in the world? No. I love Star Crash. Not a great movie by any stretch of the imagination, but I find it charming. Now, look, again, my movie tastes are totally snobbish, but I do find I'll tell you what, a movie, Battle Beyond the Stars, Roger Corman's Battle Beyond the Stars, 1980, James Murakami, production designer turned director for that movie. I don't know if I pronounced his name correctly, which John Sayles, who's a great filmmaker in his own right, The Return of the Caucasus 7, he wrote the script for Battle Beyond the Stars, which is a total riff on the Magnificent Seven, which is, of course, a riff on the Seven Samurai. I love Battle Beyond the Stars. As far as a low-budget B movie goes, I mean, they're trying to retell the story of the Seven Samurai and the Magnificent Seven in space. It's charming, and there's a lot to love about it. James Cameron famously worked on the visual effects and helped to design Nell. The Battle Beyond the Stars' main starship is actually it's a ship that has breasts and also looks like the female reproductive system. Not a vagina, but the internal. It has the fallopian tubes. It has the womb, the uterus. It has all of those things. I mean, who would think to do that? And it has the voice of a woman. I love that. And I enjoyed that movie. Now, is it A-list? No. But there's a charm and a wit to it that I really enjoy. I love the secondary characters. I love Shad, you know. It's good. I really enjoyed that film. And I find a lot to love in movies that a lot of people don't think are great. But I think I have pretty good taste in films. I think there are movies that are just bad that I think are bad that I don't like. I also don't like movies that try too hard to be camp or cult movies. You know, a cult movie, you can't make a cult movie. You can't set out to make a cult film. It'll never work unless cult movies like The Room. Tommy Wiseau thought he was making the greatest movie ever. It's become a cult movie. But if he tried to make it a cult movie from the beginning, it wouldn't have worked. So I agree with you. I am a film snob. I don't like to watch bad movies, but I do find enjoyment in a lot of films that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily find interesting. Here is a letter, another letter from Mike Castro. Hey, Rob, I have a bit of behind the scenes questions. I have a bit up, pardon me. Let me start again. Hi, Rob. I have a bit of a behind the scenes question that I'm trying to get some insight on. We have a documentary reality TV pitch with a network, and part of the idea we have includes using IP on an episode to episode basis, i.e. episode 1 is Superman, episode 2 is Batman, etc. And in each episode, we want to create our own imagined movie trailer for a movie that doesn't exist starring that character. Do you have any experience with licensing to know what kind of a license a TV network would need to air episodes like that? We just want to make sure we're not pitching something that is completely outside their budget. I heard that using 15 seconds of Knight Rider costs $2,500, but we were hoping that it'd be cheaper to film our own content using the character rather than licensing existing TV movie footage. Basically, I just don't know the kind of license needed to have an entire docuseries episode centered on the history of an established character, using licensed images here and there, and then creating our own video and concept artwork into a 2-minute trailer at the end of every episode. I know you were in Schnepp's Superman Lives documentary, which was really awesome, by the way. So I was wondering if you know what kind of hoops they had to jump through in getting the rights to film the documentary about Superman Lives and also recreate scenes from the script, even though documentary rights are probably different than episodic TV rights, or even just in your experience working with and around the studios for Trek and Superman Returns. I'm sorry for the super specific behind the scenes question. This is just the first time we've been approached to pitch a show, and we want to be super careful with the opportunity. I really love your show. My co-producer actually got me to first start listening to you with Campia, and that's how I found Robservations. We're really big fans and always appreciate your genuine approach to every subject you discuss. I hope it wasn't too weird of a question. I can't wait to hear your next stream. Live long and prosper. Mike Castro. Well, Mike, first of all, a fantastic question. But here's what I would say. I don't mean to burst your bubble, but what you're going to do would absolutely require, I think, licensing, because, again, especially when you're going to try and pitch it to a TV network that might not have any kind of ownership rights or the ability to acquire them from someone else. If you're going to be showing Batman, you're going to be creating Batman material from scratch. You are using someone's IP and making money off of it. That is a huge no-no. Believe me, I could talk to you ad infinitum about this, including being involved with the Axonar project. But once you're doing something like that, if you're making a documentary, you have what's called fair use on your side. So you can talk about things, and there is fair use presenting things in a documentary format. So it's iffy. It's really iffy. But if you're going to go back and you're actually going to recreate Batman iconography, like if you're going to use the logo, you're going to use the bat shield or something like that, you're in trouble. You run afoul of those things because there's trademark law and copyright law. So you would have to be very careful. It's again, because it's a documentary series, but it's still a series that you're making money off of, that you're being paid to make. So it's really sort of nebulous. And showing characters with this kind of iconography is really difficult. However, if you were going to recreate, and also with animation, John was skirting the edge, and he had gone to Warner Brothers and told them what he was doing. And I think they didn't go after him because Tim Burton was in the movie, and a lot of people, Tim Burton gave a lot of material, a lot of behind the scenes material. A lot of people who'd worked on things for Warner Brothers gave behind the scenes material. And I think ultimately, because Tim Burton was involved and because John had gone to the studio to ask, they left the film alone. And ultimately, I think it was a very worthwhile movie because it shows how sometimes a studio movie doesn't get made despite the best intentions of everyone, including the studio. It's tough. I think that maybe you should. There's ways like you could do lookalikes, like a Batman lookalike, do recreations and explain that these are in fact recreations. But it's interesting. I'd really consult a lawyer first. And even if you want to do an imagined trailer, people still know what it is, but it depends. I mean, I don't know enough about the context of your show, but I would say you could get away with it. There's ways of getting away with it, but you have to be clever about it. But you can't use like the S shield on your Superman because that's a trademark. So, but you can show a character that is redolent of Superman, you know. But it's a great question. I want to thank you for asking it. That's what I'm glad to be of service. I love when I can answer questions like that on the air. It's as long as I can be worthwhile like that. I think that's a really good question. But yeah, you're skating on thin ice, my friend. And I would just say, look into it. You definitely should consult a lawyer. But because it's documentary, it's covered, I guess, under fair use. It can be, depending on what exactly you want to do, like making a fake trailer for a Batman film. I mean, that might be covered under parody and fair use. So you could get away with it. It depends. Again, I don't know enough about it. So we shall see. But yeah, so that's what I would suggest. I think but again, a very good question. I really appreciate you asking. But I think there's ways you can get away with it. You're just going to have to be clever, and you're going to have to really look into parody and fair use laws, because you're not like going after a third or fourth tier character. You're going after, according to your letter, Superman and Batman. So you got to be very, very, very careful. It's that could be rough. But yeah. But it's a good question. I do like that question. So, you know, it's back to this. The thing about it, I wanted to talk more about the Star Trek PICARD series, because I don't like what I saw about it looked interesting to me. And of course, I did report hearing about when I heard what the show was about, and Brian Fuller, and reaching out to him and discussing a little bit about it with him. It was, again, one of the things I don't think that I leaned into enough is that there's a lot of times that properties get developed both on, I mean, I knew people that were developing The Magicians, and that they ended up not being the showrunners, and The Magicians were based on a book. So what they were developing was similar. There's always similar ideas. And with the Star Trek PICARD series, the fact that they had a pitch and they drew from that pitch, and a lot of it, the idea of 7 of 9. Now, there's parallel development and things like that, but it was pretty specific to lean into the Borg the way they leaned. It's interesting because I had heard from various sources that the original pitch for Star Trek PICARD just involved the Borg coming back. And that was how I heard about the show at first. I didn't really realize at the time that that was Brian's original pitch. And the way they brought the Borg back was very steeped in Star Trek canon, that Brian Fuller steeped it in Star Trek canon, because, you know, he's not stupid and he's very aware of Star Trek canon. But still, his frothy mix of Borg expats and all that, the concepts that he was dealing with were very Voyager centric. And while, yes, in the Countdown comic, they did say that the Narada was built with Borg technology, it's not like, so you had Kurtzman and Orsi already also utilizing those ideas. It was kind of a bastardization of what they'd both come up with, but Brian Fuller should have been involved. And I wasn't trying to accuse anyone of outright theft, but he was the one that initially came up with a pitch, and it was submitted. So it was out in the world. But the thing that worries me, and I want to get back to this whole idea of what Norman was talking about, and franchises and what we love. You know, it's very difficult for me, especially having worked on Next Generation and interviewed Patrick Stewart literally for hours about Star Trek, and you can see that on the documentaries. By the way, I heard that CBS is releasing, prior to the PICARD series, a PICARD Blu-ray set, and they're releasing the Next Generation movies, and then they're going to also re-release in this package our single disc Best of Both Worlds and Chain of Command discs, including the documentaries I made. Now, why is this significant? As many people know, Roger Lay Jr. and I produced all of the documentaries on Star Trek The Next Generation, in addition to Enterprise. But while we were doing this, CBS decided to release single disc, what they called movie-only versions of Star Trek two-parters. They did 5. They did Best of Both Worlds, they did Redemption, they did Unification, they did Chain of Command, and they also did All Good Things. Now, All Good Things was released as one episode originally, but they split it up into 2 parts after it was shown. So what we did was we asked, because we always looked at opportunities, we asked to make more documentary materials for these single discs. So I did half-hour documentaries. Roger recorded new audio commentaries with people involved. There was some deleted scenes and special features that you can only get on these single discs. And these single discs had a lot smaller of a print run. So they are putting the Best of Both Worlds movie disc, where they cut Best of Both Worlds into one long movie, and then also Chain of Command, which they did the same thing for, into what we call the movie versions of these. And they're including those discs. Now, a lot of people would say, how can you do a PICARD set and not include Inner Light and not include Family? The reason that they're not including those is because then they would have to make a new master that they would have to press from. They only have the Next Generation episode sets with those episodes. They never made single disc episodes of those. They'd have to make a whole new master, which they're not going to do. It's easy for them to repackage a PICARD primer disc, but I'm happy about the fact that if you're going to buy that, or somebody's new to it, or somebody's still buying Blu-ray, I don't know how many of you are, you get not just the Next Generation movies, but you do get these 2 discs with hours worth of documentary material that I was a producer on, which not a lot of people saw. And what I really love about my documentary that we did for Chain of Command is we went and got Ronnie Cox and interviewed him. And it was a delightful interview, and he's great. And those, both the Best of Both Worlds documentary and the Chain of Command documentary, are a half an hour long each. So it's a total of an hour of new material that we did for those single discs. And even if you have the box set, if you didn't get the single discs, that's a way to get them in this PICARD primer. So that's pretty cool. I'm pretty excited that they're doing that. But so, the PICARD series, to me, I will say flat out, I want it to be good. I really do. My friend Darren Doctorman's working on it, who's at Star Trek LV right now. I want the PICARD series to be great. I have no animosity toward Star Trek series until I've seen them. I don't have any faith in the creative team. I just think that going back to the familiar it's pretty obvious. I mean, okay, go back to the Borg. But it would have been really interesting to see a Star Trek show that treaded new ground. I've often talked a lot about a Dan Simmons novel that I really love called Phases of Gravity. That's about a fictitious astronaut who landed on the moon, and now he's later in life, he's dealing with, what do you do once everything you've ever done that's of note has happened in the past? How do you move forward? How do you find value in your life? And I wanted to see more of that. And I agree. Maybe we'll get that in this show. Maybe we'll see more of that. I don't know. I just don't have a lot of faith in what I've seen in the last 10 years of Star Trek writing. Just the writing. And also the design. There is no fealty to the original Star Trek. Everybody wants to. The last 10 years, people have wanted to remake Star Trek in their own image. And then their own image is not as three-dimensional as the Star Trek that existed. And while it's a great coup to get people like Patrick Stewart to come back and play Picard, which I'm very excited about because I love Patrick Stewart, Brent Spiner coming back as Data, even Jerry Ryan coming back as 7 and 9, and Jonathan Del Arco coming back as Hugh, I know that Kirsten Beyer had a lot to do with that, because there's no way that you can tell me that the writing staff, that Kurtzman or Akiva Goldsman, they're going, yeah, let's bring back 7 of 9 and let's bring back Hugh. No, Brian Fuller first came up with bringing back 7 of 9, and I'm sure Kirsten Beyer came up with bringing back Hugh. But I'm excited. until I'm not. And I won't be excited if the show turns out to be bad, but I want it to be great. Again, it's all in the writing. They've got all the money they need. I mean, it's amazing with all the money they need, where they really have to apply it the most is with scripts. Vegetable Tube is here, says, by the way, thank you for supporting the channel, Vegetable Tube. I very much appreciate that. I am watching Yancey Derringer on Amazon Prime. Have you ever seen the show? I have not, but I love the name Yancey Derringer. What a cool name. Is it? I am completely unaware of Yancey Derringer. I would love to know what that is, but now I'm going to have to go find out. I would watch a show called Yancey Derringer. I think that's what a cool name. Totally cool. I love it. Yancey Derringer. That's been very nice. I really like that. But anyway, so my love affair with Star Trek to begin with has been lifelong, literally lifelong. And I still love Star Trek very much. I love a lot of things very much. And I understand that we're now in a phase where, just like with Star Wars, the reason Star Trek exists and the reason Star Wars exists is much different. And when you're making these things, they have to serve corporate masters now. It's interesting because under the Berman era, they understood what they had to do. It was understood. But now, even the people that are making Star Trek are cutting themselves a slice off of that merchandising pie, and that's fine. But you don't have people running Star Trek because they loved and feel passionate about Star Trek. Look, anybody who wanted to make Star Trek, I don't care who they are. If you have a Kevin Feige of Star Trek, if I was the Kevin Feige of Star Trek, I would completely understand what my corporate masters would expect and need from me. But I also understand what merchandising would sell. And I also understand what stories could be made that would appeal to the masses and also be great Star Trek. I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think you just have to have more of a holistic understanding of Star Trek. Kevin Feige is as successful as Kevin Feige is because he has a very unique combination. He was a fan that worked for Richard Donner first. He worked under real filmmakers, and then he worked on 13 different Marvel movies before he started the MCU. Kirsten Beyer, I love her Star Trek novels. Michael Chabon, great novelist, but they weren't, necessarily TV people. Kirsten understood Star Trek, but she didn't understand how to play that game very well, I would imagine. And she was always marginalized. I'll bet you she's, they keep her around. Now she's probably proven herself, but I can't imagine when she first started. Actually, I've heard what happened when she first started, and it's not exactly they embraced her as one of their own because she was outside the entertainment industry. But anyway, it would be great to hear about people that are really passionate. Look, when they come on board, I'm sure the people that I know that are working on the Nickelodeon series, they love Star Trek too. They love it. But, they're going to be working, in that case, when you're working under animation people, there's going to be a tight ship, and they're going to make it their way, and they're going to make it'll be animated first and Star Trek second. And that's probably the way that it should be when it comes to animated shows. But again, it's just part of the Star Trek universe. Let's just make Lower Decks and now a Nickelodeon series. Let's make a show for kids. To me, I want it to be good. I do. But I think it's weird that they're making a Star Trek series for kids as opposed to making a Star Trek series for everybody. I never felt the Clone Wars was just for kids. I've always been surprised, but I might be surprised. Maybe it will be great. Who knows? Well, everyone, that brings me to the end of this Robservations number 185. Robservations, show about something brought to you by Lucky Tiger Men's Grooming Products for those men who want to look good and feel great. If you go to their website at getluckytiger.com, you punch in PGS, pardon me, you get 20% off your order. PGS for Post-Geek Singularity. I want to thank all of you, all the people that support the channel. Thank you so much. And for everybody that's been supporting me on the website as well, the Burnettwork.net. Hopefully, Cousin Neil, soon we will have the Space Rob video game to be play tested if you're a member of the Burnettwork website, the Burnettwork.net. Should be fun for people to show. I know, Neil, it's been almost a year in the making for the Space Rob video game. It'll be fun to see how that turns out. So I want to thank you for that. And thank the moderators, Jim, Terry, Detective Jim, the Honorable Mayor Mike Bodden from Riverdale, Iowa, Greg Smith, and I think I said everybody, Greg, Terry, Jim, and Mike. Yes, thank you for being moderators. But thank all of you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community, the most hospitable, let's keep it that way, the most hospitable community on the web. I want to thank you all. And I want to thank you to like this channel or like these videos and subscribe if you haven't. Hit the little bell so you get notifications. It helps with the YouTube analytics. I'm seeing it firsthand with people I follow that suddenly aren't appearing in my own feed, and I follow them. It's very strange. So help a brother out. And thank you for being here. I'll be back tomorrow. I also will be tomorrow at the Long Beach Convention Center. If you are in town, and let me get this right, at the Long Beach Convention Center tomorrow, there is a weekend convention for people that love, of course, they love Halloween. And I'm going to the Midsummer Scream, and I will be on the Collection Complete panel, collecting in the horror space with Jemmer. And that'll be at 4 o'clock tomorrow at the Long Beach Convention Center. Stop on by. And keep looking out for me because I am the commissioner on the Schmodown. We'll see for how much longer. So you can catch me there. You can catch me playing my character of the captain, who is now the commissioner of the movie Trivia Schmodown. And there you go. But I also want to say before I sign off, remember that every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. All you have to do is listen. Thanks for supporting the channel. It means a great deal. Thanks for liking things and commenting on the website. You guys are doing great. I love reading all the comments on the chats and all that. It's a lot of fun. Can't wait to hear what people think about this topic. And I will see you probably tomorrow, maybe earlier. If not tomorrow, because of my busy schedule, I'll be back on Sunday. So, have a better day.